Yeah, I can't promise that I will do that well. If we go back, like, okay, now it's like 3, 2, 1, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the iGaming Next podcast. Today with Martin Lycka, Martin Lycka, the Director of Regulatory Affairs of GVC. It's really nice to have you with us, Martin. How are you today?
Thanks for having me, Pierre. And I'm sure that we'll have a very nice chat, perhaps not only about gambling. We can even talk about hockey as we've done just now. But crucially, yeah, thanks again for having me. And I'm doing really well. How have you been?
Yeah, I have been very good, thank you. And yes, maybe there'll be a little hockey curveball here and there today. Who knows? The reason I mispronounce your last name, because it is Lycka, you say.
It is Lycka,
yeah,
in Czech, but I suppose I can bring you luck in Swedish, can't I?
Exactly. Yeah, I was going to ask you this because you know this already. I would assume that Lycka...
I've been told.
Yeah, Lycka in Swedish
Sweden,
means...
I'm considered to be lucky. Well, I'm considered to be lucky for all the Swedish people. Bring them luck.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a little bit part of your job, I presume. So Lycka, it's the luck and it's happiness, you could say as well, is the word. So you have a very nice last name from a Swedish perspective, I must say.
Thanks, that's very kind. Well, for others to judge whether my birth brings happiness to people normally, because it's all about regulation. It's predominantly about all the doom and gloom that we will be talking about right now, I presume.
Yeah, I guess, but one might argue that you are a little bit the superhero of the iGaming industry, you could say, kind of saving us from over regulation and these sort of things. That is a little bit your job. Can you introduce yourself a little bit, by the way, for those who don't know you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Czech by origin, British on paper. I joined the gambling industry nearly 11 years ago. I joined the legal team of what then was called Betfair, and as the audience and you well know, is part of the Flutter group these days. And after 8.5 years with Betfair, mainly on the international regulatory and legal side of things, I decided to move on and join GVC back in April 2018 in my latest capacity of Director of Regulatory Affairs. And I'm also quite proud to be serving as one of the trustees of the GVC Global Foundation as well as the GVC Foundation US.
Great, thank you, Martin. And also, I've scoped through your CV a little bit on LinkedIn, and I've seen that you have had a number of opportunities to work with various trade associations as well. I know you've been a part of the EGBA, Spelverantwoord, and so forth. So gaming regulation is really runs in your blood, so to say, the last decade or so.
Yes, it's become part of my DNA, for good or for worse.
Yeah, brilliant. So what better person to kind of have an update on the regulatory landscape today within the gaming industry. So to kick things off, Martin, that is exactly where I would like to start in general. I wanted to kind of ask you if about like kind of the recent updates within the industry and various jurisdictions. Is there anything the last couple of let's say like 2 or 3 weeks where we've seen movements in certain key markets or anything like this that is interesting to bring up here and now as a current update?
Sure, quite a few things have actually been happening, partially as a fallout from the COVID crisis, and I'm not be judging right here, right now, on how I may believe it will all pan out. I'm just hopeful that everybody out there is healthy and that the whole thing will peter out in one way or another and will go properly back to the, I suppose, the new normal. But as you well know, on the back of the pandemic-related restrictions, a number of jurisdictions that either already have or maybe in the throes of regulating their online gambling markets or gambling markets at large have felt the urge to introduce a number of COVID-motivated restrictions. To give you but one example, Spain introduced severe restrictions on gambling-related advertising during the pandemics, while other jurisdictions even went a bit further and temporarily suspended existing online gambling licenses. So, of course, now we're in the throes of dismantling some of those restrictions, but not necessarily completely. So in terms of the headline updates, going back to Spain once again, the Spanish government has now put forth a proposal as to how gambling-related advertising might look like going forward. The key decision is expected to be taken in October. Of course, you've been kind enough and I've been privileged enough to be invited to your show about Germany. So as the audience might know, the 16 German states have, thanks God, finally agreed to regulate the German market for all the online gambling verticals as of the 1st of July next year. And in the meantime, the debate has emerged as to how the market could be controlled or regulated, if you will, in the run-up to the new regulation. So that's another key update from my perspective. Of course, a lot of happening in the US, not only the fact that both hockey and basketball, well, even baseball are all back. Let's see what will have happened to the NFL season. But a number of regulators have taken another look at internet gaming. Illinois is in the throes of finalizing their new regulatory regime and licensing. Virginia has just released a set of regulations and they are rearing and ready to go. North Carolina, Ohio, of course, looking at the big states. The whole industry is looking at the state of New York with bated breath whether that by now legendary constitutional amendment will be required for mobile sports betting. And of course, prospectively, huge opportunity for the whole industry. A lot of investment has been made as of late, including at our end, so by GVC into our joint venture with MGM. And of course, last but definitely not least, it is expected that in the next couple of months, the UK government, together with the UK regulator, will kick off review of the 2005 UK Gambling Act. So yeah, quite a few moving bits and pieces that will ultimately co-determine the future destiny of this industry. And fingers crossed, it will be as good as it has been, if not even better.
Yeah, the industry at us is similarly at crossroads at the moment, as these changes are happening now, kind of accelerated by COVID to some extent too. I mean, there's a lot to discuss, of course, and I wanted to, if we go back to Spain, as you mentioned, the ban on the or potential ban of a regulation of sports advertisement. So just before that was announced, I think just a couple of days before, Betson announced their kind of shirt sponsorship of the football team in Ibiza. And so can you explain a little bit, like, for a company like Betson, how might that affect a partnership like this? Are they not able to continue that partnership, for example?
So we understand that there will be a transitional period for dealing with the fact that the rules are expected to change. In terms of my view on the proposed regulation as a whole, I completely see the point of the Spanish government that something might need to be done about the volume of advertising, because they definitely would not want to go down the UK route of the past, whereby, as you would know, during football games breaks, there would be nothing on telly but gambling-related advertising. And I truly believe that the industry, in particular in the UK, has moved on from there. On the other hand, such draconian restrictions as it is being proposed by the Spanish government, I fear, might end up being rather counterproductive, because it will make it much more difficult for customers to distinguish between the licensed and unlicensed operators. The whole industry, together with the authorities, and again, crucially, it's all about the customer, in my view, will use one of the key channels or avenues or platforms, if you will, for conveying responsible gambling messages, because that's, in my view, what advertising, and it has started serving that purpose as well. And ultimately, just like in case of many other too drastic or draconian, if you will, regulatory restrictions, there's a big risk that customers will simply end up voting with their feet, so to speak, and will be only incentivized to gamble with operators that are not licensed, in this case in Spain. And that will trigger other issues such as potential public health issues, and it will most certainly, it's not the biggest concern, but in my view, it's still one of the primary concerns, because it may also lead to decrease in investment this industry has been consistently making over the years in Spain. And if other countries go down that route, they may be befallen by the same issue. And as you made the point about sponsorship. Yeah, so Betson, just like the rest of us who happen to be sponsoring Spanish football clubs, we will have to deal with it. And I'm confident that we will be able to do it. But ultimately, the influx of those funds that also have been used to support youth sports and so on and so forth, and have been raising awareness about the social ills associated with gambling I've already alluded to, then that levy may unfortunately run dry. And I don't think that's a good thing, and it's quite counterproductive.
Yeah. Would you say like a middle way, a middle ground here would be something like allow the gaming companies to sponsor the teams where the money is actually used for, like you're saying, youth teams and something positive to keep the clubs going, but perhaps restrict in mass media, then let's say in the advertisement between, like in the games, for example. Is that a middle ground? Or how do you see a more reasonable restrictions on gambling advertisement in Spain?
Yes, I'm a big proponent, and hopefully that mimics what you just said. I'm a big proponent of moderation and reasonableness in this regard. So to my mind, it crucially, when it comes to advertising, it comes down to the volume. That, in my view, is the biggest issue. If there are way too many adverts, they can unfortunately trigger a lot of negative reactions, both in terms of increasing the risk of gambling addiction, although it has to be said that according to a number of studies and other pieces of research, there isn't a proven link between the two. But of course, problem gamblers, it may trigger a certain type of reaction, in particular if there was to be too much of that advertising, or if it's too flashy, too frequent, and whatnot. So I suppose in terms of the middle ground, I think what you've suggested would make perfect sense. Look, shirt sponsorships are that they do not only help raise profile of the legitimate license operators, but ultimately also help the football teams or other sports clubs, in particular in the lower divisions. And I reckon that to some extent, this argument or this fact gets underestimated, because we'd all be watching Barca, well, let's not talk about the Bayern game, taking on the likes of Real Madrid, Valencia, and you would get to see the logos. But the point I'm trying to make is that these guys are largely not dependent on sponsorship money from betting companies. But just like in the UK, Germany, many other places, it prospectively may be the case of the minor US sports as well. There are sports teams out there whose budgets are dependent on sponsorships coming from within the gambling industry. And I suppose to go back to the initial point about moderation, sensible or reasonable watersheds that reflect the market reality. So the kickoff times of the key games, for example, or the fact that the Olympics may be taking place at the other end of the world, or some events could be exempted from the gambling advertising watershed. So really, in my view, it's all about doing everything within reason, so that a marketplace is created that on the one hand allows for efficient consumer protection, but at the same time, because the two go hand in hand in my view, allows companies such as GVC, Bet365 and all the others to launch a sufficiently attractive customer proposition that would prevent customers even from thinking about betting with unlicensed operators.
Mm-hmm. And in all of this, you have the regulators trying to, restrict the gaming operators from causing harm and so forth. And you have the trade bodies who are working actively with the regulators as well. But what responsibility do the operators have in all of this to self-regulate, so to say, even in regulated markets, and do the right thing?
That responsibility is all pervasive, so it needs to permeate everything we do, in particular as regards responsible gambling or safer gambling, which is the UK term these days, if you will. So I believe that in particular in the last few years, the industry has been prepared and has taken on a lot of responsibility and liability in this regard. We've shown our readiness or openness to work with the regulators, in our case, pretty much all around the world and on all continents, because ultimately we need to be singing from the same hymn sheet as the regulators are in a bid to duly protect the customers, including potentially, if need be, if required, protecting customers from themselves. If any problem gambling issues have unfortunately gone way too far, then the operator definitely needs to step in and make sure that no further harm or no harm whatsoever is done, including self-harm. Hence GVC's responsible gambling strategy and programs led by the Changing for the Better and the UK industry-wide efforts that have resulted from the Marcus of Harm strategy that, as you will know, allows the industry to identify any such nefarious issues early, or at least early enough. And we have introduced processes, policies, and mechanisms that allow us to intervene, because ultimately, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, because you yourself might have heard it from me before, to my mind, it's all about sustainability of the market. And it's in nobody's interest, including the industry, the government, to have the gambling market populated by addicted gamblers, because that leads to a whole plethora of issues that, as I have suggested, we are doing our very best to help prevent. On the other hand, the bottom line is that a vast majority of users of our products and services, and that figure usually knocks about or is in the region of 98-99%, can, thanks God, enjoy themselves reasonably, responsibly, and they genuinely gamble for fun. But if in any jurisdiction we end up with regulation, and I have absolutely no issues with strict regulations, that makes perfect sense, but at the same time they mustn't be out of kilter with the market reality, and they must not be turning the regulatory screw way too tightly, because then it could.
Okay, I think we lost Martin for us a little bit here. Let's see if he.
Now the image is getting. Sorry about that. That's the gremlins.
Okay, I lost you a little bit there, Martin, but now it seems to be back. So can you recap the last 20 seconds or so?
Sure. So I very briefly talked about my views on the future of the gambling markets, in particular in terms of how we can assure that they are sustainable. So in my view, it requires collaboration between the industry and and the regulators, because the industry also very ably represented, going back to one of your points, by the trade associations, both on the domestic or individual country level, as well as either globally or at least Europe-wide. Because what nobody wants to happen is for the license regulated markets to be populated with addicted gamblers. And in that regard, the other point I made was that between 98-99% of the users of our products, or our customers, if you will, can and do enjoy themselves in a responsible fashion, which is absolutely critical. And the final point was that if we, and by we I mean both the industry and the governments and the regulators, if we ended up in a territory that would be replete with too draconian regulation, then I'm afraid, as I've already said, that customers will end up being incentivized to bet with unlicensed operators with next to no or even no protection. And I don't think that anybody wants that.
No. On the question of the trade associations in general now, and you have good experience in various trade associations, of course. I want to ask you a little bit. Obviously, a lot of the trade associations have been popping up during the last couple of years. So the iGaming industry now has representation, let's say, in quite a lot of different jurisdictions, who are actively lobbying and working together with the regulators and so forth. How much influence do you think that the trade associations have in general now? And do you feel that because they are so young generally, do they still have some way to go to have real influence in kind of the political landscape when it comes to lobbying towards politicians specifically? Because sometimes it feels like we are discussing and talking with the regulators on an active basis, but obviously politicians have their own view on the world, and they aren't necessarily listening that much to the messages that we have to say. Do you recognize that a little bit too?
Yes, I do. So perhaps to start my answer by a more generic point, it's no secret that the industry has at least several reputational issues to grapple with and get into grips with. But at the same time, I believe that also thanks to the trade associations, we've got the handle and the hang of it, and we're definitely getting better. So the level of being self-conscious about what we do and how we do it, and whether it's really effective and efficient, that has, quite frankly, in particular in the last couple of years, in my view, gone through the roof. And the industry has been progressively recreating itself, and definitely on the responsibility liability side of things in the last 3-4 years, in my view, has resurrected from the original ashes. So we are in a completely different and much better place than we were, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago. I suppose at that point, licensing in individual jurisdictions was still somewhat a novelty. So we got to get the handle of that, but then these days that's bread and butter. To answer your question about the individual, or about the associations, I believe that the likes of the EGBA, and I may be biased, I happen to be sitting on their board, but they keep doing a great job, not only in Brussels, but on the Europe-wide level. And I can't speak highly enough of the BGC. They've gone from being the rather squabbling RGA to being a body that is being trusted by the decision makers. Look, the decision makers may have a completely different views on a large set of issues that we've been dealing with, but they definitely seem to be prepared to listen what BGC as well as the individual operators have to say. And then in the individual jurisdictions, to answer the other part of your question, I believe that, well, you're right. It comes down to the maturity of the market. Some jurisdictions, such as Sweden, needless to say, have regulated only recently. Other jurisdictions have been getting there for quite a while, the likes of Germany and the Netherlands. And then fingers crossed, it's all happening now. And that, of course, will ultimately mean transformation in the lives and the practical day-to-day operations of these associations. Because in particular, in the likes of Germany and the Netherlands, they're very much involved in all the lobbying and political processes. Once the markets have regulated, then the nature of their activities will change, because they will have to, just like in the other countries that have regulated, they will, one of their, or the key mission will be, if the regulation's any good, of course, then they will be on a mission to help preserve the status quo, and then perhaps suggest improvements to what we will have got. So to give an example of a trade association that I believe has really performed well and delivered, it's DOGA, the Danish association. It's assembled all the main players, operators, if you will, and the market, and it's done a great job in terms of establishing a fully working relationship with the Danish authorities. It's considered a trusted advisor, and that's exactly what we need. And I suppose the other piece relates to the individual operators, because it's not as though all our interests would completely overlap, or let alone be identical. At the same time, I believe the industry, the other thing that we have got a little bit better at, is to work together within these associations, but also on an operator by operator basis. For example, by forming one-off coalitions in relation to specific issues. Because, and I reckon what helps in that regard is that sometimes, I'm very grateful for that, sometimes going to these meetings or trying to build those coalitions, as I called it, it feels like a big family reunion. There are new people come in, of course, it's great to have them, and some people unfortunately leave, but I reckon, at least in my world, there are quite a few very great and very nice people that have been around for quite a while, which, again, as I've said, we may not necessarily agree on everything, but at least with a bit of ethics, the working relationships are there, and we sort of know what to expect of each other. Of course, for example, the US might have somewhat thrown a cat amongst those pigeons, because some people move on. My role, I've been involved in a lot of matters in the United States. Hopefully, that has not resulted in me having neglected any of my European duties. But even there, you get to meet new people. You get to meet people from the States, which is great in itself. But again, in many cases, you come across at conferences, meetings, wherever else, you come across your good old friends from Europe as well.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much to dissect here in general. It's interesting points that are being lifted on the note that, like you were mentioning, that the iGaming industry is really coming together in some ways. It's pretty incredible to see, actually, because you don't see that in other industries to the same extent, I would say. Why do you think that is? That as you're saying, it's a big family in the iGaming industry. We all know each other. We all work within this little bubble that we have, so to say. And how come do you think that the iGaming industry in particular is so good at collaborating between competitors?
Well, don't get me wrong, it could still get better, but I reckon that, again, in particular in the last few years, the whole industry has been at the receiving end of quite a few, and that may be an understatement, regulatory curveballs and other types of curveballs and issues that we've had to deal with, in which case people usually pull together to shore up, so to speak, the industry's defenses. I reckon that's if there are any emergencies, critical issues that need to be tackled, then at that point we are at our best, and we can really pull together. As I've said, once the risks or dangers might be averted, then we probably, at least to some extent, still go back to our good old selves. And it's not as though we would have been at each other's throats or one another's throats. Of course, on the other hand, we all represent individual companies that happen to be competitors.
That's a good way of putting it. And also, I'd like to just extend your friend Peter Paul, the story of the Spelverantwoord. I know you have a history there as well. He said that iGaming has no friends, and perhaps that is also a reason for us to stay together, to fight all these external forces that are against the industry in its entirety.
Sorry, that's sadly true. On the other hand, I believe that we've been working very hard on at least trying to change that, because needless to say, there's a very close link. It's not necessarily an umbilical cord, but a very close link between sports and betting at the very least. And I believe, again, going back to the Spanish example, but even the US example, of course, it's taken, to be fair, it's taken the US leagues a while to come to the realization that sports betting thing may actually be a good thing. And I completely agree with that. But to give you the Spanish example, as you might have seen, in particular in relation to the latest regulatory shenanigans in association with the proposed advertising rules, it would appear that the likes of the Spanish media and then Spanish sports are prepared to support the gambling industry in its quest to secure a set of rules that would be much more in touch with the market reality and would help prevent all the potential nefarious ramifications that we've already discussed on this podcast.
Yeah, and that's a good point, I think, because especially when it comes to Spain now, kind of banning the sports advertisement, which is obviously in turn going to affect the already affected Spanish football clubs and so on, who are obviously struggling through this pandemic as it is already. So to lose another revenue stream is obviously another big hit to them. So you would assume that you would have kind of the general public behind you in issues like that when it comes to kind of protecting the sports clubs particularly.
Yeah, well, sadly, I would have to argue that, and I'm with you, don't get me wrong, but that's still a bit questionable, because I believe the general public may have, with all due respect, slightly distorted view of this industry. And as I've already admitted, at least to some extent, it's self-inflicted. And it's not as though we'd started doing it only now, but it had taken the industry quite some time to realize that we need to get better at reaching out to not only our customers, but crucially the public at large, with a view to explaining to them what we're all about. And if you look at GVC, all the charitable activities that we've been undertaking, I've already mentioned the GVC Foundation. We happen to have been working with the likes of Inter Milan, Borussia Dortmund. We've formed a partnership with the Players Association of the NFL in the States. We've recently sponsored a tennis tournament that was run by Janko Tipsarevic down in Belgrade against all the odds, and despite all the issues that his friend Novak Djokovic happened to have had in relation to his tournament. Well, wasn't by any means his fault. I think some of the players gone a bit wild and rogue, but let's not get there. The industry is really trying very hard to improve its image. It's yet to be seen to what extent we will be able to succeed. But I reckon crucially, we've taken not the first step, but the first set of steps if you will. So we realized something had to be done, and we are at the stage whereby we're figuring out the most efficient way of delivering on this aim or intention. And then we're hopeful that it will start bearing its fruit. That's not to say that all our detractors or gambling bashers, if you will all of a sudden go away. But, in their regard, it's not only me. I reckon most, if not the whole industry, would love to have a proper debate, including with these people, and try to convince them that we are doing something that's good. Let's have that. Let's have that debate. If we end up agreeing to disagree, then fair enough. Everybody's entitled to have his or her view.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, actually, to take the debate. I mean, to be in the public eye, to answer these questions, to be there, to talk about what we are doing, because as you are rightly saying, the public doesn't get this information of the incredible hard work and about the fact that at least the major organizations want to follow kind of an ethic code to do the right thing for the longevity of the industry and so forth. And obviously, the measures that are being taken, they don't change the perception right away. This is obviously retroactive change that will occur. That as time goes, you'll see the changes in society, in the cultures, and how they view the gaming industry retroactively and so forth. So I think the more the industry from now on can be in the public eye, and really talking about the steps that are being taken, the easier it is for the general public who doesn't gamble, and they are still the minority, doesn't gamble. So they would always look at gaming companies with suspicion, because they don't know them. It seems foreign to them, so the more they see this other side of the coin, the quicker we can change their perception. But I also wanted to mention that, and I mentioned this before on the podcast too, that there is examples of when the gaming industry hasn't had this stigma against it as it has had the last couple of years. And I grew up during the poker boom in Sweden, when every single little person left, right, and center, and his mother and his father was playing online poker, which did not have this stigma around it. And at that time, online poker, I remember at one point in Betsson Group, it was accounting for a majority of their revenue came from poker specifically. And at that time, the organizations weren't seen as anything that brought stigma with them. Poker as a product was very much accepted. And I think same thing goes for sportsbook as well, at least in Sweden. It doesn't seen as something that is stigmatized per se. I think it's more the casino product who can be seen as something negative and so forth. So the point I'm trying to make is that it is definitely possible to change the perception of the industry, because we have already seen examples of that in the past. And I think maybe we should look back at that time and learn from how the public's perception was at that time, and perhaps what we can do to turn the tide towards that again.
I believe you're absolutely right, and I believe that we're both singing from the same hymn sheet, because it indeed boils down to further education and being prepared, and we are being prepared to be transparent, being prepared to take changes, including regulatory changes, on board, and indeed getting even better at demonstrating that the industry is here for entertainment purposes.
Yes.
At the same time, we do everything in our power to protect our customers by giving them lots of advice, tools, and all these tools and pieces of advice and policies are constantly being revisited and improved. Plus, crucially, the other point you made, and that sadly still every now and then gets rather underestimated, if not forgotten or neglected, is the fact that the online gambling operators, or gambling operators full stop, they have fantastic technology resource and people who can pull out miracles to, and I'm but a dumb lawyer, as I normally say. So I have next to no clue about how it all works. I probably shouldn't be saying that out loud. But yeah, there are people out there who are fantastic in terms of protecting the systems from third-party attacks. They're fantastic at making sure that the KPIs of the operations or the levels of reliability are definitely up there, over 99%, if not higher. And then I suppose the point I'm making is that we rely on fantastic pieces of technology to run the games, to verify our customers, to have all the audit trails about their betting and gaming behavior, responsible gambling, sports integrity. So yeah, you got this whole technology stack, both individually and collectively, that we can rely on. And perhaps the next step, although this is already being considered, is also to figure out what are the other uses we could put our data to. We use it for verification AML purposes. We are ever improving the RG processes based both on human interaction and technology, even AI, those robots and whatnot. We use it for sports integrity purposes. So we are one of the guardians of the integrity of the games. But then the question is, of course, within the bounds and limits of GDPR, for what other purposes can we use the data to further improve the customer experience, but also the levels of consumer protection or customer safety, if you will? Because this is really what this is about. Also, the sheer number of transactions these platforms can work through on a daily basis is simply phenomenal. If you look at the world's biggest stock exchanges, the gambling platforms go beyond that, and there's a lot to be said about that. Perhaps a theme for one of your next podcasts, because I'm by no means qualified to talk about gambling technology, but I would suggest that there's a lot of potential to present that technology or give it the credit it deserves, also as purpose of the sort of the redemption of the industry exercise.
Yeah, and you're making interesting points, and obviously there's a lot on the technical side where the iGaming industry is using to protect the players and to discover fraud and these type of things. I think from a public perception point of view, something that I think is a bit of a needle in the eye in the public perception is kind of the VIP segment in general. And I think that's where we have seen a lot of these stories in media where, they were enticed to play more, by being given a trip or by giving an iPhone and these type of things. And I think from a really high level point of view, I think that's more kind of where the public gets the information from. Maybe these type of changes, although they are like technological advancements and they are amazing technological features to avoid fraud, I think it's still on these type of like simple points of kind of being gifted something to play more that are kind of in the public eye a lot. And I know that GVC are kind of taking a step back from that segment in general. Correct me here if I'm wrong now, Martin, but if I remember correctly, you guys are kind of dismantling the VIP teams a bit, or at least decreasing them and handling that segment in a more safe manner, so to say. Is that correct? And if so, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the VIP schemes are definitely being reviewed, because indeed some of the misperceptions amongst the public have stemmed from there, and indeed in that regard things have changed a lot. I believe it's also clearly, it links back to the whole debate about advertising and crucially bonuses, what can, what cannot, what should not, what must not be offered to customers. And I suppose critically, the final point relates to the combination of affordability and rewarding customers for their loyalty, of course, in a reasonable fashion. Because as you will know, in many other industries, if you look at British Airways, perhaps not these days for obvious reasons, but you would be rewarded for your loyalty. So these days it would seem that half of the flight has a priority boarding, so it defeats the purpose of those perks a bit, but I shall digress. The key point I want to make is that in my view, and as I've said, these schemes are being reviewed, changes are being made because that has turned out to be a necessity, but it's linked with the whole debate about affordability. And if a customer, in my view, in my personal view, if a customer X can afford to spend Y amount of money on his or her betting, again, in a reasonable, sensible fashion, then that customer, subject to KYC, if required, enhanced due diligence, and all the other checks, crucially including the continuous responsible gambling and fraud monitoring, then in my view, that customer should be allowed to spend that money. Of course, as soon as that behavior has gone out of the bounds I have just defined, then indeed the operator needs to take appropriate action. The operator needs to intervene at the very start, have a chat with the customer about what's been going on, and then, if need be, take more drastic steps. And I suppose, again, as regards bonuses, in my view, it comes down to, of course, the amounts, but crucially also volumes or frequency. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that perhaps the key consideration in that regard is to put in place a system that would ensure that customers' affordability is duly scrutinized, and also on that basis determine whether the bonusing level, the rewards, of course, all within reason, because indeed, as you've pointed out, customers must not be incentivized to overspend. Customers must not be incentivized to behave in a way that could ultimately lead to them incurring a gambling problem.
So all in all, solve player responsibility and you solve all issues of stigma.
Yeah, you can put it that way. Yeah, that's the big challenge for the industry to destigmatize itself. And in my view, the only way that can be achieved is by means of positive action and even more education or explanation, if you will, while being prepared to learn from the mistakes of the past, the mistakes that we learned usually the very, very hard way, and rectifying them and move on and do things even more efficiently.
Yeah, funnily enough, like the iGaming industry is growing up like a human. We are in our late teens now. We have made our mistakes, and now we are becoming adults. Let's say as an industry.
I would love to be able to say that about myself, but the gray hair.
I cannot see a single gray hair from here, Martin, so you're good.
Against me not being a teenager anymore, but I'm told that I'm a borderline millennial, so I'll just go with that.
Fantastic. Yeah. You look great, Martin. Let's say that.
Oh, you're too kind.
Okay. I know we're running over, but I have just one area more I would like to talk about. Do you have a couple of more minutes in general? Are you in a rush?
Let's
great. Because I'd like to travel to the US with you now on perhaps not the BA, but I guess maybe we'll take a little boat together over to the US at the moment, and hopefully we'll board and cross into the country without being sent back. So now we're in the US, Martin. Obviously, all eyes on this market at the moment. I would like to start asking you, there is an election looming, as we all know, that is turbulent, to say the least. Do you think that the outcome of the election will change how states and even on a federal level the markets will open up?
Well, as you know, most of the 20 plus US states that have already regulated sports betting, and the number of states that have regulated internet gaming is picking up as well. So what the reason why I went for the word most first is that I do expect, to a large extent, even regardless of the outcome of the presidential election, that in 3 to 4 years from now, some 35, 40, I don't think that all of them will have regulated sports betting, but a large majority, or most of them, as I started saying, will have regulated sports betting, and probably internet gaming will be perhaps slowly but surely, and definitely gradually, catching up with that. Of course, the current administration is associated somewhat with some of the detractors of sports betting and internet gaming. I think it's fair to say that the whole industry prefers Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory to the other Sheldon. And I will leave it there. But of course, there's still the pending court case or pending litigation in relation to the scope of applicability of the Wire Act. But as I've already said, a number of US states have plowed on regardless, because they, just like the industries, they see regulating sports betting as a huge, not only economic opportunity, where we actually spent most of this podcast talking about high standards of consumer protection, which is absolutely critical. And I hope that the European operators that have partnered with the American operators, that we can work together. And one of the crucial assets that we are bringing over across the pond to the United States is our regulatory experience. Again, I've already said that, the lessons we've learned the hard way. And America, so both the US and Canada, if, for example, Ontario ends up regulating in the foreseeable future, have, in my view, a great opportunity to avoid making the same mistakes, in particular on the RG side or VIP side of things, that the European or global industry, if you will, have made. And I'm hopeful that if I'm by no means in a position to do it, really, but if I can try to convey a message or give a piece of advice to the US regulators, that would be it. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Of course, the regulation needs to be Americanized, so to speak, so customized. It needs to reflect local cultural idiosyncrasies. But ultimately, what these regulators are trying to do have been done before. So at least as regards the basics, I'll use the phrase again, there's no need to reinvent the regulatory wheel. Just take the good stuff and try to learn from the mistakes, and the likes of us, as in GVC, but all the other operators, will be only keen if we have been given that opportunity to point out the issues we have faced and have a very open debate with the governments, the regulators, the lawmakers, decision makers, about how we believe these regulations should be spun, how they should be produced, so that they work, so that they generate, in particular, post-pandemic, well, fingers crossed, we are getting closer to the post-pandemic era, that they will help with the financial or fiscal losses that the governments have endured, but also crucially will create an environment that will be conducive to innovation and high standards of consumer protection.
Yeah, great. And the last question, also, Martin, on this is...
That's the hockey one, I'm hoping.
Except for the hockey one. So traditionally, it feels like that the US land-based casinos have been very opposed to online operations. It feels like that they have been protective over obviously what they have and so forth. And perhaps you can give some clarity if that statement is correct or not. But obviously now, GVC, you guys are working with MGM now to start the online operations. You have the other conglomerates that are obviously working with other online operators to start their online operations in the US. Do you feel that the casino lobby is working for the online market now in the US? Do you feel that the US has strong representation when it comes to online gaming, like from online gaming side these days?
I believe that things have certainly evolved. Also, this may sound cynical, but also as a result of the pandemic, because it's needless to say that a number of the usual casino goers had to stay at home. So the US, and not only the US, it's also we're talking about the US, the land-based casino industry have started looking into other ways or opportunities to serve their customers. And I suppose you hit the nail on the head, the fact that the likes of GVC, many others, have managed to partner up with traditional US-based and brick and mortar operators is a testament to the fact that the sports betting regulation, the internet gaming regulation in the US is in the ascendancy, and that the industries, they still have some way to go in terms of getting to know each other, but we're definitely getting there. I believe the working relationships that what used to be the two industries that are now slowly merging into one another, in my view, are getting more and more robust. They're definitely solid, and I hope that at one point we will be presenting a completely united front when it comes to any big issues, big questions that may surface or crop up in the future. Of course, the industry, the merged industry is still relatively new, and just like in any other country, in any other scenario, I reckon at the very beginning, everybody has a strong tendency to stick to what they know on both sides again. And I'm not saying that the industries would be aggressively protecting their territories, but of course, if you're already established somewhere, you do have existing relationships and whatnot. And I promise this will be one final hockey related remark. But if you think about the NHL, look back in the 50s, 60s, the 70s, brushing aside the fact that the players from the ex-communist countries, they had got their clearance to go and play in the NHL only from the 80s or the late 70s onwards, so they had to migrate. I reckon even in case of the Swedish players, the Börje Salmings of this world, I don't think that he was originally received with very open arms at Toronto, at least by his teammates, who were thinking that this was inherently Canadian game, and fair enough, we'll have some US folk in our teams. So if I may use that analogy, perhaps it's very, very similar. It's not as though we were entering, or we would have entered, a pristine territory, hic sunt leones and whatnot. There have been gambling businesses before, and we're all adapting to the new reality. So as long that makes sense, that's how I would put it. We just need to get to know each other even better, but the very solid foundations have already been laid down.
Yeah, and as you rightly mentioned, with the pandemic happening, shift going from land-based to online, and you hear this phrase all the time that I feel personally is a little bit overused, but the new normal. Maybe GVC and the other operators are the new normal when we go into an online environment.
That's an excellent way of it. Yeah, that's the new normal. Besides trying to complete Netflix, of course, and we started running out in this household.
I know the feeling. And a final remark as well would be that we talked about the relationship between land-based and online. In Sweden, we have a saying that love always starts with a fight, and perhaps that is what we are seeing here as well.
Yeah, well, in a similar vein, I would argue that first dates are never easy.
It's very true. Very true, very true. Okay, so, Martin, you're going to get a little test here now. Before we close this off today. Who won the Stanley Cup in 2014.
Jesus Christ! Now I will look like a right idiot. Was it the Chicago Blackhawks or Los Angeles Kings? One of the two.
One of the two. I give you that much. Do you want to take it? It's. I mean, we are from the gambling world here. We're not gonna get away that easy. You have to say one of the two.
I'll say the Hawks because they came to my mind first, but I might have gone.
Too bad. Well, Blackhawks won 2013 and 15, but the Kings won in 14. So better luck next time.
Yeah, exactly. I hope my Canadian friend Troy's not watching this because he'll be giving me a lot of grief.
Yeah, I give you the finger then. Martin, it's been. I mean, not even 10% of the points I wrote up here we managed to go through. This is an endless topic. It's super interesting to hear your point of view. So I really thank you so much for doing this today. It means a lot. It's really interesting. I hope it's been interesting for the listeners as well. I'm pretty sure it has been. So yeah, thank you so much, Martin.
Thanks again for having me, and thanks again for being such a pleasant company. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Have a lovely evening, everybody. And thank you also to the sponsors, Pragmatic Solutions. Check out their platform and have a great day. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.